We give a lot of attention to hyper growth startups, technology companies, companies that are aiming to be unicorns, and things like that. While most people, however, work for small businesses or want to own a small business, and your work at Hello Alice connects a lot of small businesses with resources and opportunities. And I wonder what trends you're observing in the challenges they might be facing compared to when you started this organization.
Yeah, unfortunately, I will say that the challenges they're facing haven't changed much. It's always, since we've launched Hello Alice, the top two needs of small businesses have consistently been access to capital and building customer awareness. Ultimately, what we hear from businesses is they're looking for ways to put more money in their pocket, whether that's through funding or whether that's through organic revenue growth. And that's really where the focus of Hello Alice sits.
Do you believe that, you're saying that not a lot has changed. How has the approach potentially had to say, okay, if this is not making meaningful impact, not that it's not making meaningful impact, but the numbers, you just, remain flat because more people are entering the space. Have you had to change how you approach these challenges?
Where we're seeing great headway is the understanding around small business. When we launched Hello Alice back in 2017, we would talk about small businesses and nobody wanted to hear about it, was the reality. People were very focused on the startup space. Everything was about tech. There were all these accelerators, incubators, and these great things happening. Nobody paid attention to small business. The silver lining of the pandemic, which impacted small businesses in lots of really difficult ways and challenged them in ways that we've never seen before, it also brought great attention to small business. And I think it made everybody recognize how much we actually lean on these businesses in our backyards, what a huge piece of the economy they are. They're 99% of businesses in the US are small. They're creating 55% of net new jobs. And so when you put a freeze on that, I think we all recognize there was a lot of tension happening, certainly at the local level in terms of how we individually depended on these businesses. But nationally, when we started to look at the economy, we said, hey, this is a huge impact in terms of how our country operates. And so in that sense, I think we've seen more attention there, a better understanding, and that understanding has opened up new products, new technology, more ability, and I think more resourcing behind these businesses. And that's allowing the companies that are fundamentally healthy businesses, it's allowing them to thrive. And now where we're starting to focus is, okay, these ones that have sort of a shaky foundation that certainly struggled during the pandemic are continuing to struggle now. How do we build up those fundamentals to help them understand these are the pieces they need to get in place so that they can capitalize on this new wealth of resources that's been created? So there's definitely a need to meet in the middle between the ecosystem resources that are available and the capital that's being created and the small businesses themselves and the work that they need to do to be able to access those resources.
Yeah, I wonder how you think about this. So in business, there is no stasis. Like if you're making the same amount of money you made last year, you're probably going down because the market is changing. The market is getting more efficient, more rich, et cetera. And so I think about how do small business owners think about growth? Should we be thinking about scale, or should we be thinking of, in the way that technology startups thinking about scale, or is there another way we should be thinking about how we grow small businesses?
The lessons that are learned from the tech industry can certainly be applied to small business in so many ways. And I would say increasingly so. If you think about the amount of technology that a business has available to them today, with AI, you can have employees, technology employees that are not paid employees for you, agents that are working for your company, right? You're opening up the ability and capacity to work and operate so much more efficiently. And so when you think about scale, I think for small businesses now, it's shifting the way that they have to think about it, right? There's still the need in the early days, build a great product or service, find incredible traction with your market, find what delights your market. You've got to go above and beyond, and what goes kind of beyond that line of satisfactory. And then start to figure out, how do you scale that? How do you automate that? How do you make that process more efficient? But tech company or Main Street small business, the reality is the approach is the same. Find your product market fit and then figure out how do you use technology and how do you use, efficiencies and systems and all of these great tools at businesses' disposal to scale, to automate, and to optimize.
When you say small business, because your response just made me think about this. When you said small business, what do you mean? Do you mean, because I've been to, like, small business can range from, hundreds of thousands to $20 million a year. And then you got micro businesses that are like kind of like, one person, shops. Like, how do you define small businesses?
Yeah, I mean, it's a broad definition. I would say depending on who you talk to, the definition will shift. According to the SBA, it's under 500 employees. What we are mostly looking at, I would say the majority of those that fall into that 99% of small businesses are under 10 million in revenue. The majority of businesses on Hello Alice are actually under 10 employees and under $1 million in revenue. And so you can certainly see, like, the biggest piece of the pie is those micro businesses that are just trying to keep the lights on. They're just trying to make sure that their employees are paid. They're just trying to make sure that they have enough money to, support themselves and ideally their families. The needs are really, week to week or paycheck to paycheck versus, thinking about these massively scalable companies.
So when you're talking about, let's just take, let's make up a business. This business is doing 400,000, maybe even less. Let's say 200,000. It's a 1 or 2 person shop, and I'll let you pick the industry. But how should they be thinking about product market fit? Because I don't hear small business owners at that level thinking product market fit. They have either a skill and they are, kind of a craftsman and they do the work. And then hopefully people buy the work from them, or, maybe they own a print shop or a landscaping company, or, how do they find product market fit?
Yeah, I find 2 really common paths that businesses go down. The first is you have a founder or an owner or a business owner who loves the product or service that they provide, and they're so focused on refining and optimizing and perfecting that product or service that they forget about the sales side. The other type of a business owner is one who is great at sales. They're super charismatic. They're great at building a team. They're great at getting energy behind something and making things happen. Not so great at refining and optimizing that product. And so where you see the sweet spot is when a business owner has a balance between those two. That's when you establish product market fit. And so I think it's not often talked about in the small business space in the same way, but the reality is that's what it is, right? Whatever product you're bringing to market, how are you putting your own stamp on that? How are you building the right brand story around that? How are you presenting it to your market in a way that is meaningful and differentiated from everybody else who's out there? Because the reality is today, you can buy most products on Amazon. You can find most services, within your local online on some level. How do you start to differentiate and make your kind of stamp in the market so that people want to purchase from you, your company, and not from the company down the street? And ultimately, I think it boils down to how are you refining that product or service, and how are you bringing it to the market in a really unique way?
Yeah, and one of the conversations I have with small business owners is we tend to emphasize support for our businesses. And one of the things that I shouldn't say frustrates me, maybe that's too strong a word, but like I don't shop at Target because I support Target. Like I shop at Target because they have what I need. And I don't know enough about the business to support it or not. And I wonder what your take is on how we shift or maybe add on just providing things people need versus relying on support, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think the burden is on the small businesses to make it easy for the customer, right? The reality is most of us love to shop small. We love to support our local communities. We want to go, we'd rather buy the product from a business that we know and a business owner who we know and want to support versus walking into Target and buying some generic brand that everybody else has. The difficulty comes is that it's hard to find those products or services. When you need a bottle of shampoo, it's very easy to walk into Target and you have every option there. How do you make it easy? And that's where I think you look at online brands and you look at people who've done it well, and they're making it easy, right? They're offering subscriptions. They're tailoring the experience to you. They're allowing you to customize and pick what's the right, perfectly right product for your hair type. Those small businesses that can do that can refine what that experience is and why it's different for one customer versus another customer, and why it's specialized and why it's easier. Those are the businesses I think that have a huge opportunity to capitalize on our like innate desire to go purchase from small businesses. But it takes time, it takes technology, it takes refinement, it takes looking at that whole customer journey from awareness to building a brand advocate. And if you can do that, people are willing, they want to spend their money with you. I always tell business owners, I'm like, the world is rooting for you. You just have to know, how do you capitalize on that willingness? How do you capitalize on those resources? And how do you spend your time kind of connecting those dots in the most efficient ways?
How have you had to, manage the resources you provide to traditionally underserved communities, Black people, Hispanic people, et cetera? How have you had to reconfigure the training, the lessons, the resources to fit the nuance? Because, if we think about our counterpart, we didn't historically, by and large, I'm painting a broad stroke here, that we didn't necessarily grow up talking about business at the dinner table. Didn't necessarily grow up talking about budgeting and investing in so many factions of our communities. So when you think about the bridge that has to be crossed for these populations of people to get to business success, what is different about your offering because you're speaking to these audiences?
It's, I try to remind everybody, I'm like, every business starts small. Every business starts small. We start with a different knowledge base, to your point. We start with different resources at our disposal. Most businesses in the United States are starting with under $5,000 of startup capital. That's a really small amount of money. And frankly, when you think about being able to pool resources across, it's why our grants programs on Hello Alice are so critical, because that tiny bit of capital can be the start of a business for somebody. Now, when we look at Black-owned businesses and Latino-owned businesses, it's often half of that amount of capital. And so they're certainly at a disadvantage when we look at the starting point. And so it's important to figure out, one, how do we bridge those gaps? And that's where programs like grants programs, corporate support programs, a lot of the NGOs that are out there are doing great and necessary work. The knowledge base, thankfully today, is available. You just have to know to ask the right questions, and you have to know how to tap into the right networks. My experience, I grew up to immigrant parents in Spring, Texas. I went to public schools my whole life. I knew nothing when I started my first company, and it failed. And the reality is I didn't lean on the resources even that I had at my disposal. I wasn't aware of the local networks that were in my town. I wasn't aware of who I could lean on for mentors. And there were people around me who were willing to help and who I could have asked. I just didn't even know the right questions to ask. And part of that means you've got to be in the room. You've got to hear the conversations. When I say the room, sometimes that's the digital room. Get in online forums, jump into LinkedIn groups, show up at your local networking event, and just hear and start to expose yourself to that. And that's one of our goals at Hello Alice, is how do we blast that knowledge as loud and far, and as you reach into these pockets of communities that aren't having those conversations at the dinner table. Because I certainly didn't, and I had the advantage of entrepreneurs in my family, and we still didn't have those conversations at the dinner table. I had never heard of venture capital. I'd never thought about getting a loan from a bank. I never considered those things. But the reality is those conversations were being had in areas that I had access to all around me. I just didn't know they were there. And so that's our job, I think, as a community, and everybody listening to this, is how do we go out and reach into our communities and go find those dinner tables where those conversations aren't being had, and start them, and just say, hey, check out this network, go look at this thing, meet this person. It's so organic, but the knowledge is spread so much further today than it was certainly even 10 years ago.
What do you find are some of the most pervasive issues plaguing small businesses from Black and Latino communities? I think about, knowing your numbers is one. Like, I was talking to a friend of mine who was building like a skincare company, and we were talking about like the cost of one bottle, like how much does it cost to make one bottle? And she had never even thought to price it down, like to get the cost down to how much does it cost to make one, that unit metric. And so they just price things, you know, because, oh, sell it for 20. I'm like, well, how much does it cost? But not knowing how to get those formulas to figure out how much does one bottle cost or one jar was like enlightening in a way, but also shocking. And so I think about, you know, having paperwork in order. Like, what are some of the things that are pervasively plaguing us?
Sometimes I think we're our own worst enemy. When I look at whether it's Black and Latino communities, whether it's, you know, any pocket of people who don't sort of see themselves in the room of the successful business owners, there's fear is a huge part of it. We're afraid to ask for help and to show that we don't know what we don't know because we feel like we should and we feel like everybody else might. I think that's a huge piece of it. The second piece is risk aversion. There is, I think oftentimes because we're not seeing the models out there, we're not seeing, you know, we see a lot of, and hear a lot of stories of failure. There's a risk aversion in terms of being able to take that leap. And I think if we flip the story and say, look, we're all still here standing and we're all still surviving in spite of those failures and in spite of those obstacles and in spite of all those things that have happened, we can do this. Yeah. And I think when you start to look at the models of being like, look, what happened there doesn't necessarily have to happen here. And how do we learn from those? And how do we figure out how to surpass those? And how do we look at the models of success around us and say, what are they doing that's different? A lot of it boils down to the conversation. When you walk in and talk to your banker and you walk into that appointment, like you deserve that loan and like you're going to be the best risk that they can take on, it is a different sort of conversation. And so when you see sort of a lot of the, you know, where we see kind of equal stats in different outcomes, so part of it is how do we present ourselves in the best light? And that is knowing your numbers. It's walking in with confidence. It's owning that space in the room. On the flip side, again, there's a lot of work to be done on how are we educating those giving the loans? How are we educating those offering the venture capital? How are we helping to model out the stories? It's, again, both sides. Like it's finding that middle ground where we can start to jump over those hurdles. But I think to the degree that you can know your numbers, you can be like the leader of your entity. You know that company better than anybody else does. You know your market better than that banker does or better than that investor does. So remember that when you walk in, present it with confidence. And you know, I think so much of it is just you've got to get buy-in. You're selling. Your biggest job as a owner is to sell.
Yeah, that's so good. I remember it was a couple of years ago, I had heard a banker say this phrase I'm about to say, and it blew my mind because I didn't think of it this way. And he said, the bank needs you. And I had always grown up thinking that, you know, we need the bank, but the bank needs you. Like the bank's business is to sell money. Like they loan money, they sell money, quote unquote, because they need it to be invested so that it can grow. They need to put it in your pocket so you can grow it and continue to all these things. So, but we the way I grew up, at least I'll speak for me, you know, like it's a little exposing. There is a fear when you get a banker ask you for documents. It's like being interrogated by a police officer, you know, in a way. It's like, you know, I don't want that experience. And so many that come from my community feel that way. But when you have this shift of thinking that the bank needs me to be successful, my question to you is, why do they need, other than just they need, you know, to grow their capital and their balance sheet, what does the bank need? I know there's, you know, community efforts that they have to be beholden to. Like why does the bank need us to be successful as small business owners?
Yeah, banks have a lot, I mean, that's their business, right? Is deploy capital to get returns on that capital. They need to put that money to work. And so, and particularly, and certainly this landscape is shifting on the daily currently, but they made great promises to get capital into underserved communities. And the reality is they're not meeting those, you know, those goals. And so they have great objectives out there. They're trying to connect, you know, they're working through CDFIs, they're working with community engagement. They're trying to lift up the performance across different areas. They're being held accountable internally and externally to their customer base. And so it's their objective. When I say people are rooting for small business, I mean everybody is rooting for small business. Your local community is rooting for you to succeed because they want to see those businesses stick around. Your banker is rooting for those small businesses because they want to be able to give more loans. They're being measured and judged on how many loans do they deploy, what is the return rate on those loans. And so your success is their success. I always say at Hello Alice, we have this great sweet spot because we get to be a mission-driven company. Because the only thing that everybody succeeds with is if small businesses succeed. Every enterprise corporation that we work with succeeds when those small businesses succeed. Our business succeeds when small businesses succeed. And the small business owners succeed, obviously, when they succeed. And so everybody needs it and everybody relies on it. It's how capital is created at the end of the day. So more purchases, more transactions, more loan volume, greater returns on investment. All of that depends on the success of the small business owner.
Yeah, that's a great segue to this. You said, and I've heard others repeat this phrase, I want your take on it, like DEI is good for business. It's not just the right thing to do, but it's good for business. And can you elaborate on how diversity creates, sort of a tangible return for business?
Yeah, I mean, listen, in anything, if you think about your funnel, right, if you want to get the very best businesses in, you've got to cast the widest funnel. And we've seen this happen time and time again. Information travels largely through word of mouth, and whether that is digitally or whether that is in person, information is getting communicated to our communities that look quite similar to us in any capacity. The more we can broaden and cast a really wide net, the best are going to filter through. And so when we talk about DEI, I think there's a great controversy today of, everything should be merit-based. And I think everybody agrees on that. The best should rise to the top. I think everyone's aligned with that. The reality is we have to make sure the best even get into the race. And so how do we help the best get into the race? And that's the way that I look at DEI is we've got to make sure, to your point, everybody's having that conversation at the dinner table. Everybody knows where to show up to take advantage of an opportunity. Everybody understands that they are meant to be in this conversation. That's success with DEI. If we do that and we're making sure everyone has access to the resources, everyone has availability to these things. Again, technology is helping to close a lot of those gaps as well, but we still have a long way to go. When you look at the disparity between the Black community and the white community, there is a huge disparity there. And we have to do work to close that in. And when we do it, the best are going to rise to the top. And that might be a Black person, it might be a white person. It's very likely going to be a mix of both, and it's going to be quite representative of our country as a whole if we make sure that everybody has the right knowledge and access to resources.
So if DEI is great for businesses, if diversity is great for business, and it's been shown that to be a great economic competitive advantage, why is that so hard to communicate to folks who want to go the other way?
I don't know that it's hard. And because I've had a lot of conversations with people on both sides of the table. And often what I hear, I think, is that it boils down to what is fair. If somebody feels like they're being passed over because of who they are on either side, and I think on both ends of the conversation, we're hearing the same thing. Somebody feels like they're being passed over for an opportunity because of who they are. And I think that's where, if we sit there and say, look, let's figure out how do we help people start from the same place? How do we help get people in the room? Instead of saying, should there be quotas? Should there be affirmative action? Should there be these things? The reality is, how do we just help everybody get in the room? To me, that's the conversation that actually bridges this whole argument and stops it from being, I didn't get it because I'm white, or I didn't get it because I'm Black. The reality is, how do we help everybody feel like they're getting a fair run at whatever the opportunity is?
You've mentioned that there's some challenge in the early days, challenging efforts in finding your lane in the small business ecosystem. And I wonder, can you share like a specific turning point when you found this is what we're supposed to be doing? Yeah,
we started, Hello Alice started very much from a mission standpoint. It was my own experience. I like mentioned before, I mean, I knew very little about starting a company, and my first business failed. And I went back to work, paid off debts, licked my wounds for a bit, started a second company that I ultimately sold, ran it very differently with the lessons that I learned, and feel very fortunate that I got to start over again, because many people don't have that opportunity. I was young and single and could handle bumps and bruises enough at the time, but it was that experience that really got me focused on how do I help others from experiencing this, because it was very difficult. I was getting myself out of debt. I was sorting through a lot of financial troubles and difficulties. And so that, I would say, that was sort of the focus always from the start, is how do we help, how do I help personally? It really started as me mentoring and supporting and connecting resources in, because when I sold that second company, the world opened up to me. It was like all of a sudden I had credibility, and I was invited to the conferences, and I was invited to the table. But the reality is many people never get there, and they never have that experience. And so I just started passing off resources to others, saying, you need to know about this. You need to come here. You need to be here. You need to be in this room. And little by little, that turned into a technology that could do that much more efficiently. We started kind of boiling the ocean, saying we're going to help the whole world, and we're going to help every entrepreneur, and really honed in on small business and on micro businesses because of the volume. Because we said, if we can solve this, it's a small segment, it's a very narrow segment that no one's paying attention to, and certainly nobody was back in 2017. If we can solve it for this narrow piece of the segment, it's the majority of small businesses. And they don't look like the businesses that we often think of when we think of entrepreneurs and when we think of successful, business people. That's not what everybody was imagining. But the reality is that is what business in America is.
When we were talking about the conversations we had growing up, or lack of conversations around budgeting and financial literacy and et cetera, you kind of touched on seeing representation of these things. And I often think about my experiences. I didn't see Black wealth and Black entrepreneurship until I moved to Atlanta in my early 20s. Because I'm from Toledo, Ohio, and I'm back here now, and I'm building businesses. But I saw success on TV, and I saw it on computers, but I'd never seen it like that way with my naked eye until I moved to Atlanta. And so I wonder about how you believe Black people who have found some level of success should show up in the world to be representative of what it could look like for those coming behind them.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I can only relate to my own experience, which obviously not as a Black person, it's hard to say what the right answer is, but I will say,
or Latina.
Or Latina. I mean, it's. I think that the key piece is how do you help people believe that they can do it? And I will say for myself, I mean, I started off my career as an investment banker, saw a lot of white male success stories in entrepreneurship. And nothing ever stopped me from thinking that could be me. I looked around and they didn't look like me, but I always believed, I was always told in my house that I can do it. Nobody ever stopped me from doing it. And so I always knew there was a pathway there. And I think the one thing that I kept throughout, even when my business failed, and even when I knew in my gut, I knew that I could achieve whatever I was seeing around me. And so I think part of it is just the conversations that we are having at home, regardless of what the path is or whether our parents know, how to navigate through those paths or not. It's just create the belief in kids today that they can do it and that they can figure it out. In terms of those who have succeeded and who have achieved, it's the same thing, right? It's going and saying, look, I did it. You can do it, because it is easier to identify certainly with someone who looks like you and someone who has had a similar path. I think we always hear, those stories of people who have overcome huge hurdles in all capacities of their life. And it gives you hope that they figured it out. Like if they figured it out, it's figure outable. Someone else can do it, and we can replicate and repeat that story. I mean, that's why I love the thing, like what you're doing and telling stories and bringing light to those things, I think is so critical, because it's proof point after proof point after proof point. And you never know which proof point's going to stick with who and what's going to resonate with who. But those stories matter, and they matter tremendously. But at the end of the day, I think it's like, how do you build up the confidence in somebody? And that comes from little wins along the way in life.
Yeah, I like that. Finally, I think there's this quote I found from you where you said, banks and venture capitalists continue to rely on incredibly limited data to make underwriting decisions. And I thought that was striking. And I wonder how you can help them bridge the gap because these outdated practices in a lot of ways, and how can small businesses better articulate those qualitative strengths, those scrappiness, like leadership ability, and when funders typically look at quantitative data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will say I was shocked, in the early days of Hello Alice. I dug a lot into the underwriting model. When I would talk to bankers at major bulge bracket firms saying they were looking at, Word documents and Excel spreadsheets and questionnaires to figure out should they give a loan or not. When all this data was available, or we would, look around for data sources and we're like, our data is this small, tiny, scrappy startup, in our early days with just a handful of employees, had more relevant and more recent data than the Small Business Administration. It's eye-opening about how little data there is on small businesses and the ability to match it. We still get calls constantly from government agencies, from Fortune 100 companies saying, hey, can you help us out with data on this segment of businesses? Can you help us understand this piece? Can you figure this out? And if they're leaning on us, I'm like, there's such an opportunity to start to piece together the stories of not just where is a business owner today, but I think the really valuable piece and what we work on a lot at Hello Alice is how do we better understand the trajectory of a small business owner? If, I start with $1,000 and somebody else started with $10,000 and we both, are at $20,000, who's on a better path and who feels like a better risk, right? And I think oftentimes we're looking at, well, you're at $20,000 and you're at $20,000 and, here's the loan I'm going to give you. That's not the full story. We have to see where did they start and where are they now to understand ultimately where they're going. And data ultimately provides that picture, right? But it's also, what have you faced along the way? What have you dealt with? What did what happened in your industry in this time? What was your cohort of others in your space doing? What was happening to other businesses in Atlanta? If, an area was struck by a, natural disaster, there was a huge obstacle, being able to look at that data and say, okay, I've got to put this lens on how this company's performing to better understand the real risk factor going forward. But we're a long way from that. I don't think banks are anywhere close to looking at that sort of data.
Yeah.
But it's my hope that if we can gather it and we can understand it, we can keep providing it and keep sharing the story. Little by little, we start chipping away at innovative underwriting models. And there are great, I would say, tests being done. And it's going to ultimately rely on the startup community and the fintech community to say, look, we did it. We're getting better returns on our investments, and you all can do it too.
Yeah.
The bulge brackets will follow the proof points.
I actually do have one more. So there was a few years ago, the SBA put out this study that said 80% of the small businesses built in minority communities, Black, Hispanic communities, are in the 80% of those businesses are in the bottom 20% of categories for revenue. So we over-index on barbershops, landscaping companies, restaurants, corner stores. And so I guess my question to you is, one, is how do we see more for ourselves? So how do we open up the aperture or the lens that there's a bigger opportunity out there? Like I think about like there's no Black-owned like Borix or Supercuts. Like there's individual barbershops, but we don't have like a chain or franchise model. And like still, like there's none of that. And not just the Black community, but how do Black people and minorities in general see bigger and see, like, instead of just doing this once, I could do this 30 times and find ways to create something that's replicable?
Yeah, that's always a tough one. It's hard for me because I think my mind works that way, probably to my detriment sometimes, because I think every time I see something, I'm like, this could be this, and I take it to, the nth degree. it is mindset, and that mindset I think is ingrained early on, and it's really hard to break that mindset. I mean, I think I've been in communities where you see a whole community that just thinks very traditionally, and they think very small scale, and they're operating well, they're brilliant at what they do, and they're skilled craftsmen and knowledgeable about their business and their industry. But the mindset to grow, because I always get in those conversations, I'm like, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about how you could do this? Have you thought of, and sometimes you sort of get this look like there is not a desire. So I think one is finding, okay, where does the desire live? Because that's a huge piece, right? And I think it can be built into any community. I think everybody has the potential to have that, but it has to be taught and learned. And so when you're surrounded in communities where the thinking is a certain way, it's really hard to break out of that. A lot of, and you see like sort of the use cases about what made somebody sort of jump out of this, what made somebody make the leap out of sort of the status quo for whatever path they were on into something, I'm going to use the word greater, although someone probably question, is it or not? I don't know. But into a more kind of scalable and efficient and effective and more capitalist model on some level, right? What creates that foundation? I think that boils down to teachers, it boils down to mentorship, it boils down to parents, it boils down to the stories and access in our communities. And so when I think about tech ecosystems and in a lot of these cities, one of the greatest things they can do, I think, is if they're having a pitch day, invite kids in from your community, invite people to come to see and watch and know that this exists. We operate in such bubbles in all of these spaces. If you run a business, invite somebody in just to come see and understand, even if it's for a day. Open those doors to start to just break the mold and at least plant the seed for something that who knows where it's going to come to life, later on. But we have to build in that exposure. And sometimes it's, taking a story and telling it in a different context, or not just having conversations about, small business and startups and entrepreneurship and tech in that community. How do we break out and go find, the business on the corner of Main Street in a town and say, here's a model. Did you even know this existed? Have you thought about this? Do you know what this takes? Do you know what it would require? Here's a couple of pathways. Some are going to jump on it and some are not, but over and over, it starts to break the mold of how we think.